The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet streets of a small Tennessee town as a dark blue Honda Civic rolled through the neighborhoods. Behind the wheel sat an FBI agent, his pressed shirt and khaki pants carefully chosen to blend in with local aid consultants. 10 years with the Bureau had taught him the art of becoming invisible, just another face in the crowd. For the past 6 months, this had been his life. Living in a modest apartment, grabbing coffee from the same diner every morning, and building a cover so perfect that even his next-door neighbors thought he just fixed computers for a living. But beneath this carefully crafted exterior lay a different mission entirely. The agent's real work began each time he opened his laptop at the local coffee shop. While appearing to type away at code, he was actually documenting a disturbing pattern. Reports of civil rights violations had been piling up in this county, but complaints mysteriously disappeared from official records. Tips came in from frightened residents who spoke of police harassment, missing evidence, and a system that seemed to protect its own. That morning, like every morning, he followed his routine. He pulled into his usual parking spot at the Coffee Bean, ordered his regular black coffee, and settled into the corner table where he could observe the comings and goings. The regulars barely noticed him anymore, just another face in their morning ritual. As he sipped his coffee, he watched 2 police cruisers roll past the window, moving slower than usual. The officers inside seemed to study every face they passed. The agent made a mental note but didn't react. His years of training had taught him that the smallest gesture could give away months of careful work. His phone buzzed quietly. A message from his handler. Another incident had occurred overnight. A local business owner's security cameras had mysteriously stopped working just before their shop was vandalized. The timing wasn't a coincidence. It fit the pattern he'd been tracking. The agent finished his coffee and headed to his car, mind already mapping out his next moves. He needed to attend tonight's community meeting, where concerned citizens would gather to discuss recent events. These meetings had become gold mines of information, with people sharing stories they were too afraid to tell officially. What he didn't know was that this ordinary day was about to become anything but ordinary. As he started his car, he caught a glimpse of something in his rearview mirror. The same police cruisers from earlier, now parked across the street. Their engines were running, and their attention was fixed firmly on him. The real story was about to begin, and nothing in his decade of FBI experience could have prepared him for what would happen next. The community meeting had run longer than expected, and now darkness wrapped around the quiet streets like a thick blanket. The FBI agent checked his watch, 10:45 p.m. His mind was still processing everything he'd heard at the meeting. So many stories, so many scared voices, all pointing to the same troubling pattern. The drive home should have been uneventful. He took his usual route, carefully following every traffic rule, just as he'd done hundreds of times before. The Honda's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating empty sidewalks and closed storefronts. Everything seemed normal until his rearview mirror caught the flash of headlights. First one pair, then another. His training kicked in immediately. Stay calm. Act natural. He checked his speed, exactly at the limit. His turn signals blinked with precise timing. Everything by the book. But the patrol cars behind him moved like shadows, matching his every turn, staying just far enough back to maintain plausible deniability. At first, he thought it might be coincidence. Small town, quiet night. Maybe they were just headed in the same direction. But after the third turn, his instincts told him otherwise. These officers weren't just patrolling. They were hunting. The radio played softly in the background, some late-night country song about lost love and empty highways. He almost smiled at how perfectly the music fit the moment. Then came the flash of red and blue lights, splitting the night like a knife. He knew the spot they'd chosen. A stretch of road between streetlights, no houses in sight, no security cameras on any nearby buildings. It wasn't a random choice. They'd done this before. Following procedure, He turned on his interior lights and placed his hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. His heart beat steady and strong, not from fear, but from focus. Every detail mattered now. Every word, every movement would be important later. The first officer approached from the driver's side, flashlight beam aimed directly at his eyes. The second hung back, hand resting casually on his holster. The agent could make out their shapes in his mirrors, noting how they moved with a confidence that felt more like arrogance. License and registration, the first officer demanded, not bothering with the usual pleasantries. No greeting, no explanation for the stop. Just raw authority in his voice. The agent responded with calm politeness. "May I reach for my documents, officer?" The response came with a sneer, slowly, very slowly. As he reached for his glove compartment, he noticed something odd. The second officer had circled around to the passenger side, but instead of watching him, the officer was studying the car itself, paying particular attention to the trunk and gas tank. That's when he realized this wasn't going to be a normal traffic stop. The air felt different, charged with something dangerous. Years of undercover work had taught him to read situations like this, and everything about this one was wrong. What happened in the next few minutes would change everything, not just for him, but for the entire department. But right then, in that moment, he had no way of knowing that he was about to become the key to unraveling years of corruption. Everything happened in slow motion, like a scene from a movie nobody wanted to watch. The officer grabbed the driver's license without a word, shining his flashlight directly into the FBI agent's eyes. Behind the glare, there was a smirk, the kind that said this wasn't about enforcing the law. This was about something else entirely. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer commanded, his hand already reaching for the door handle. The agent knew his rights, knew every procedure these officers were breaking, but also knew this wasn't the time to argue. Sometimes the smartest move is to play along, document everything, and wait for the right moment. The cool night air hit his face as he stepped onto the asphalt. The officer's partner had moved closer now, twirling a set of handcuffs around his finger like he was putting on a show. Their badges caught the moonlight. Local county sheriff's department. The agent made mental notes of every detail, every badge number, every word spoken. Hands on the hood, the first officer barked, using his foot to kick the agent's legs further apart. The metal felt cold under his palms. He could hear them talking about him like he wasn't even there, using words that would make their mothers ashamed, throwing around assumptions based on nothing but their own prejudices. They started searching his car without permission, without probable cause. The agent stayed silent, watching their reflections in his car's polished hood. One officer ripped through his glove compartment while the other pulled up his floor mats. They weren't looking for anything specific. This was about showing power, about making someone feel small. Well, one officer said, holding up the agent's laptop bag. "What do we have here? Probably stolen, right?" They both laughed, sharing a joke that wasn't funny. The agent kept his face neutral, but his mind was recording every second, every violation, every abuse of power. Then came the handcuffs, cold steel biting into his wrists a little tighter than necessary. They pushed him against the car, making sure he could see them ransacking his belongings. His wallet hit the ground, contents spilling across the pavement. His phone followed, screen cracking against the asphalt. But what truly caught his attention was their confidence. These weren't nervous cops making mistakes. These were men who'd done this before, probably many times. Men who thought they were untouchable. Men who had never faced consequences for their actions. The night air grew colder, or maybe it was just the chill of realizing how deep this problem went. Other cars passed by on the distant highway, their headlights brief reminders that somewhere, normal life was continuing. But here, in this dark spot between streetlights, something very different was unfolding. The agent flexed his fingers behind his back, feeling the bite of the handcuffs. He'd been undercover in dangerous situations before, faced down drug lords and mobsters, but there was something uniquely terrifying about being at the mercy of people who were supposed to protect and serve. What he didn't know yet was that these officers were about to make the biggest mistake of their careers. In their arrogance, in their certainty of their own immunity, they were about to cross a line from which there would be no return. The sound of a cigarette lighter clicking open cut through the night air. Something was about to happen, something that would change everything. And still, the agent waited, watched, and remembered every detail. Because sometimes, the best weapon isn't a gun or a badge, it's the truth. The smell hit him first, the sharp, unmistakable scent of gasoline. Through the reflection in his car window, the FBI agent watched as one of the officers unscrewed a small red container. The liquid splashed against the back seat, soaking into the fabric. His stomach tightened, but his face remained calm. Years of training had taught him that sometimes the hardest thing to do was nothing at all. "Nice car you got here," the officer said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. Shame if something were to happen to it. His partner filmed everything on his phone, laughing like this was just another Friday night entertainment. The red gas container made a hollow sound as it hit the pavement, empty now. The agent could feel the rough texture of handcuffs digging into his wrists as he stood there, forced to watch. The officers had positioned him just far enough away that he could see everything, but not close enough to do anything about it. The night air had grown colder, or maybe it was just the chill of witnessing something so deliberately cruel. One of the officers pulled out his pack of cigarettes, tapping it against his palm with theatrical slowness. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet night. A few cars passed on the distant highway, their headlights briefly illuminating the scene before disappearing into the darkness, like shooting stars that couldn't help. "You know," the officer with the cigarettes said, "I've always wondered something." He pulled out a cigarette, placed it between his lips. The lighter's flame danced in the darkness. "How fast does a car really burn?" His partner chuckled, still recording, his phone's screen casting a blue glow across his face. The agent watched the cigarette's red tip glow brighter as the officer took a long drag. He knew what was coming next. His mind raced through options, calculations, consequences. Inside that car was 6 months of evidence, his FBI credentials, everything that could prove who he really was. But revealing his identity too soon could jeopardize the entire investigation. The cigarette arced through the air like a tiny meteor. Time seemed to slow down as it tumbled, end over end, sparks trailing in its wake. It disappeared through the open car window. For a moment, nothing happened. Then came the whoosh, a sound the agent would never forget. The flame started small, just a flicker on the back seat. But gasoline doesn't burn slowly. Within seconds, the interior was engulfed. The heat pushed everyone back, the officers still laughing, still filming, clearly pleased with their handiwork. They'd done this before. That much was obvious from their casualness, their expertise in choosing the spot, their confidence that there would be no consequences. Orange light danced across their faces, illuminating expressions that had stopped being human. The fire reflected in their badge numbers, making them easier to read, easier to remember. The agent's car, his cover, his evidence, all of it was burning. But something else was about to burn too. Their careers, their freedom, their sense of invulnerability. Because what these officers didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that their perfect crime was about to backfire spectacularly. As the flames reached the glove compartment, they would reveal something these officers never expected to find. Something that would wipe those smiles off their faces faster than the fire was consuming the car. The agent stood silently, watching not just his car burn, but watching justice inch closer with every passing second. Sometimes, he thought, the best trap is the one your target sets for themselves. The fire reached the hidden compartment just as the first officer was taking another video. A metallic glint caught the firelight, drawing both officers' attention. There, among the flames, something golden flashed, an FBI badge, its metal surface reflecting the orange glow of the fire. Time froze. The phone recording the scene dropped to the ground, forgotten. The laughter died in their throats. In that moment, they realized they hadn't just committed a crime. They'd attacked a federal agent. Is that? The first officer couldn't even finish his sentence. His partner's face had gone pale, all the arrogance replaced by raw fear. The badge wasn't alone. Next to it, somehow untouched by the flames, lay a folder marked Federal Bureau of Investigation in bold letters. The agent, still handcuffed, watched their reactions change like seasons. From cockiness to confusion, from confusion to understanding, and finally to pure terror. Their body language shifted instantly. Gone was the swagger, the certainty of immunity. Now they moved like cornered animals, desperate and dangerous. "Get the cuffs off him," one officer whispered urgently. Their hands shook as they fumbled with the keys. The other officer had already started backing away, eyes darting between the burning car and the approaching sound of distant sirens. Someone had seen the fire and called emergency services. As the handcuffs fell away, the agent slowly rolled his shoulders, taking his time, letting them stew in their panic. He didn't run, didn't shout, didn't make threats. He didn't need to. The weight of what they'd done was crushing them more effectively than any words could. Their phones, which moments ago had recorded their crimes with such glee, now felt like ticking bombs in their pockets. Every photo, every video, every message, all evidence of not just tonight, but possibly every other time they'd done this to someone who couldn't fight back. Through the crackling of the flames, one officer started frantically trying to explain, to backtrack, to somehow make this go away. But the agent just stood there, memorizing their faces in the firelight, watching their careers in freedom burn away as surely as his car. Fire trucks were getting closer now, their sirens piercing the night. Soon this quiet spot would be crawling with witnesses. More importantly, it would be crawling with evidence. Evidence these officers had helpfully documented themselves. The agent finally spoke, his voice calm and clear over the sound of the flames. "I believe you gentlemen have some phone footage I'd be very interested in seeing." It wasn't a request. Both officers knew their next moves would determine not just their careers, but their entire futures. The night had started with two officers thinking they were untouchable. It was ending with them realizing they'd just touched something far bigger than they could handle. Sometimes justice comes in unexpected ways, and tonight it had arrived in a ball of fire. Dawn hadn't yet broken when FBI vehicles swarmed the small Tennessee police station. Agents in dark suits moved with purpose, their badges catching the fluorescent light as they strode through the doors. Inside, chaos erupted as word spread about what had happened the night before. The two officers sat in separate rooms, their swagger from earlier completely gone. One stared at his hands, the other kept asking to call his wife. Neither looked up when investigators entered their rooms. On the table between them lay their phones, treasure troves of evidence they created themselves. In the tech lab, specialists worked through the night. With each recovered video, each text message, each deleted file, the picture grew clearer and darker. The burning car incident wasn't a one-time mistake. It was just the latest in a pattern stretching back years. The FBI agent, now wearing a fresh suit, watched through one-way glass as digital forensics experts combed through the evidence. His burned car had been the key that unlocked something much bigger than anyone expected. Videos showed similar incidents, different victims, same methods. The officers had recorded everything, thinking their badges made them untouchable. Internal Affairs investigators arrived, looking grim as they carried boxes of personnel files. They'd started pulling records the moment they got the call. Complaint after complaint had been filed against these officers, all mysteriously dismissed or lost in the system. Now, those buried files were coming back to light. The local news vans started arriving around sunrise, their satellite dishes rising like metal flowers in the parking lot. Inside, the police chief faced the hardest morning of his career. Each new piece of evidence that crossed his desk made his face grow paler. This wasn't just about two rogue officers anymore. This was about systemic failure. Other officers in the department walked on eggshells, wondering what else the investigation would uncover. Some came forward voluntarily, sharing stories they'd been too afraid to tell before. Others nervously checked their own phones, remembering times they'd looked the other way. The FBI agent's handler arrived mid-morning, carrying a laptop with 6 months of undercover reports. Together, they matched the newly discovered videos against reported incidents. The pattern was undeniable. What had started as an investigation into civil rights violations had cracked open something much deeper. By afternoon, the evidence room was overflowing. Sticky notes covered the walls, connecting incidents, dates, and officers involved. The investigation had taken on a life of its own, growing bigger with each passing hour. What these officers didn't realize when they decided to burn that car was that they also lit a fuse, one that would expose years of abuse and cover-ups. Sometimes, the biggest cases break open not with a whisper, but with a blaze. And as the sun climbed higher in the Tennessee sky, it shone down on a department that would never be the same again. The digital forensics lab hummed with activity as screens displayed video after video. Each new file revealed a darker picture than the last. The tech team had recovered everything, even files the officers thought they'd deleted forever. Modern phones never really forget, they just hide things better. One investigator sat back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. He'd been staring at screens for 12 hours straight, but what he'd found made sleep impossible. The videos told stories that statistics never could. Traffic stops that weren't really traffic stops. Peaceful moments that turned violent for no reason. Laughter in the background as people begged for their rights. "You need to see this," he called to the FBI agent. On his screen, a text message chain stretched back months. The officers hadn't just been acting alone, they were part of a group. More names appeared, more badge numbers. Officers from other precincts, even some from neighboring counties. They shared tips, warnings about where cameras were placed, congratulations when someone got away with something particularly cruel. The agent leaned closer, his reflection ghostly in the dark screen. 6 months of undercover work had shown him pieces of the puzzle. But these messages filled in gaps he hadn't even known existed. The network was bigger than anyone had guessed. In another room, investigators pieced together a timeline on a massive whiteboard. Red marks showed known incidents. Blue showed suspected ones. Yellow sticky notes held witness names. The board had started empty that morning. By afternoon, they needed a second one. By evening, a third. The phones also held photos, trophy shots of damaged property, crying victims, burned vehicles. Each one was carefully tagged as evidence, each one a nail in the coffin of careers built on abuse of power. The officers had documented their own crimes better than any investigator could have. What struck everyone hardest was the casual nature of it all. These weren't messages from people who thought they were doing wrong. These were messages from people who thought they would never face consequences. They joked about their actions, planned future incidents, shared tips on avoiding dash cams. One recovered video showed an elderly man's garden being destroyed while he watched helplessly. Another showed a family's holiday decorations being torn down while children cried inside. The officers had filmed it all, thinking these videos were funny, thinking they were untouchable. The FBI agent stood in the middle of the lab, watching teams of people process the evidence. Each person who saw the files came away changed. This wasn't just about dirty cops anymore. This was about power, about trust, about what happens when people who are supposed to protect decide to prey instead. A young tech analyst called out from her station. She'd found something new, a hidden folder full of spreadsheets. The officers had actually kept records, dates, names, locations. They treated it like a game, keeping score of who could cause the most trouble without getting caught. Outside the lab, the world was still spinning. People were going about their daily lives, unaware that in this quiet room, a system of abuse was being pulled apart piece by digital piece. Sometimes justice moves slowly, gathering evidence bit by bit. But sometimes it moves all at once, in an avalanche of truth that buries everything in its path. And this avalanche was just beginning to fall. The federal courthouse stood tall against the morning sky as reporters gathered outside. Inside, the main courtroom buzzed with tension. Local residents packed the public seating area, many of whom had their own stories about the accused officers. This wasn't just another trial. This was their chance to see justice in action. The evidence presentation began quietly but built like a symphony. First came the technical experts, explaining how they recovered deleted files and verified timestamps. They showed the jury how metadata proved the videos were authentic, unedited. Each explanation hammered home the deliberate nature of the crimes. Then came the videos themselves. The courtroom fell silent as screen after screen showed what these officers had done. The prosecutors didn't need dramatic speeches. The evidence spoke for itself. The officers' own recordings, their own voices laughing as they abused their power, did more damage than any witness testimony could. The FBI agent sat in the witness box, his voice steady as he described that night. He explained how he'd been investigating civil rights violations, how his burned car had cracked open a case bigger than anyone expected. The defense lawyers barely questioned him. There was nothing they could challenge about his story. What really shook the courtroom was the spreadsheet evidence. The officers hadn't just committed crimes, they'd tracked them, scored them, treated them like achievements in a twisted game. The jury's faces showed their disgust as the prosecutors walked through entry after entry. More officers came forward to testify, breaking the blue wall of silence. Some spoke about how they tried to report problems but were ignored. Others admitted their own guilt in looking the other way. Each testimony added another piece to the puzzle, showing how deep the rot had gone. The defense tried arguing about pressure, about difficult jobs, about split-second decisions. But they couldn't explain away the laughter in those videos. They couldn't justify the spreadsheets. They couldn't defend the text messages that showed how carefully these incidents were planned. Technology had turned against those who abused their power. Every photo they'd taken thinking it was funny. Every video they'd recorded as a trophy. Every message they'd sent believing it was private. All of it now served justice instead of corruption. As closing arguments approached, the mood in the courtroom shifted. This wasn't just about punishing two officers anymore. This was about changing a system. The jury understood that their decision would send a message far beyond this one courthouse, this one town. Sometimes justice wears a suit instead of a uniform. Sometimes it speaks through spreadsheets and metadata instead of gunshots and sirens. And sometimes it arrives not with a bang, but with the quiet sound of 12 jurors reaching for their verdict forms. The verdict changed more than just lives. It changed an entire system. 6 months after the trial, the police department looked completely different. New faces walked the halls, wearing badges that meant something different now. Every patrol car carried upgraded cameras that couldn't be turned